what's up? Welcome back to the channel. And on today, we are going to be discussing the idea that there is special genes. There is a genetic component to running. And perhaps if you don't have this specific running gene, perhaps we should just give up now. If that was actually the case, I probably wouldn't be making a video about it because I try and keep things a little positive. But I'll be honest, the genetic component to running, to sports in general, it's not nothing. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts on it. So let's get into it. All right, my friends, like I said, I really can't wait to hear your thoughts on this topic, but this isn't just going to be about you dropping a comment on your own thoughts. I decided to talk to you guys about this after I found an article in Trail Running magazine, and that article is titled, appropriately, "Is There a Running Gene?" with a subheading of "Which Role Do Genetics Play in Athletic Performance?" I love this. I think because it provides like a built-in excuse, an excuse that there's nothing else that I can do about it. If ever I don't meet my goals, I can just blame it on genes. But all kidding aside, well, actually, I'm not kidding. That isn't actually a legitimate excuse, but generally we don't use that on a daily basis. We still go out there and we do our best to reach our goals. We set goals and then we try and strive for them. Now, this is a perfect example or reason why we shouldn't compare ourselves to others, because ultimately we are all very different. I mean, we're all the same, but we're also different. Now, the article starts out by saying that Kilian Jornet back in 2019 said that he admitted that genetics were a part of training. Well, not training, but athletic performance. And that's hard to argue when his VO2 max is measured at 92. Mine at the time of this recording, according to Garmin, is 57. If I look at Coros, it's 47. So that's what I mean about making excuses, because you know what? I just can't compete with Kilian Jornet because I didn't have good running genes passed down to me. But that's not the be all and end all of it. Now, I'm not saying that I will ever be able to compete with Kilian Jornet. I won't. But that doesn't mean that I, and probably you, can't at least try to reach our potential in whatever sports we choose. Because, and this is kind of the crux of the whole thing, this is the nugget, because although that there are genetic variances that make one person slightly better at something than someone else, there is more research that agrees that training and environment are better contributors to overall outcomes in sports performance. So while I may use that as an excuse that the reason I am not competing against Kilian is because he has a genetically boosted VO2 max compared to me, I can put myself in an environment, well, that's not really how that works, but I can use the environment that I'm in to make me the best athlete, the best runner that I can be. And it's not just VO2 max that makes a difference in whether or not we are going to be a world-class runner, world-class athlete. Dr. Joyner, who is quoted in the article, he works at the Mayo Clinic and he's worked with a ton of athletes. He said when scientists started looking at specific gene variations that would make an athlete an endurance athlete or a power athlete, they thought there'd only be a couple of gene variations that would actually make a difference. But it turned out to be much more complicated, which right now is pretty good for me because I get to make a whole video about it. So let's get started with the actual genetic part of running performance. And we've already talked about VO2 max, but just as a refresher, VO2 max refers to the amount of oxygen that our bodies can absorb or use while training. So when we're running, oxygen is converted into energy. So the more oxygen that we can actually use, the more energy we have, the faster or the further we can run, right? That part of it is pretty simple. And scientists have identified 97 different genes that could predict a VO2 max. And they say it could possibly contribute to 50% of the athlete's trainability. Now, I did say possibly contribute, so that possibly is very much a caveat. It's like saying maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That study also goes on to say that the correlation between a high VO2 max and regular training made the findings of the study less consistent. So then they end by saying that further study is needed with more controls. But just to give you an example of one study published by the Surgery Journal, they found that in a 24-month period, so 2 years, non-elite athletes saw a 50% bump in their VO2 max, with only 3 days of running at 140 beats per minute heart rate and 2 days of lifting. Of course, those findings also raise a lot more questions. A heart rate of 140 beats per minute could be very different for me than it is to you. Let's say we are looking at a high school athlete. If they are running at 140 beats a minute, I mean, that's going to be like high zone 1, low zone 2 for them, you know, depending on other things. But for me, 140 beats a minute is very much zone 3. Like, it's really doing nothing for me. I don't feel like that's improving my VO2 max. I also didn't look up this study to actually read a little further into it, but the whole labeling of people of non-elite athletes encompasses everyone that is not elite. So that's an entire population. We could have couch potatoes. It's unlikely that you, if you are taking a few minutes to watch me talk about running, it's unlikely that you're just running 3 times a week at a heart rate of 140 beats beats a minute. You may be doing a bit more than that. So with that said, if you were to suddenly go to that, your VO2 max may actually decrease. Okay, the next genetic component of running is lactate threshold. And the lactate threshold is reached when your body reaches an exertion level that is not sustainable. So you're using the oxygen in your muscles, your body produces pyruvate faster than it can be used. Pyruvate becomes lactic acid and acidosis, and that's when you start getting those heavy legs, that burning feeling when you're really pushing it. So of course, when your lactate threshold is higher, you are going to be able to run faster for longer. So yes, that is definitely something that genetics can contribute to, but unless you are a brand new runner, you know that you can train your lactate threshold. I mean, obviously, if we're starting at a higher level, we're going to be able to train it to a higher level, but don't think that just because you've been genetically gifted a certain level, you can't build upon that. You can. Remember, training and environment are the two biggest factors to becoming a better athlete, a better runner. Okay, the next genetic component to running is muscle fibers. As people, as humans, we're generally predisposed to have type 1 or type 2 muscle fibers. Type 1 is commonly called slow twitch muscle fibers. Type 2 is fast twitch muscle fibers. People with type 1 muscle fibers can generally hold a steady state for a longer period of time, and people with type 2 muscle fibers are generally more explosive. Their muscle fibers fire more forcefully, but they tire a little quicker. Fast twitch muscle fibers rely on anaerobic respiration, and they're 100% fueled by glucose. Slow twitch or type 1 muscle fibers rely on oxygen. So do you know which type of muscle fibers you have? Because I do. I spit into a little tube and I sent it off to the internet, and they sent me back a report. And my report said, Matthew, your genetic muscle composition is uncommon in elite power athletes. And I've got to say I was a little disappointed to see that, especially because my wife is the exact opposite. Her muscle fibers are common in elite power athletes. Now, 23andMe, the company that I sent that little tube of spit off to so they would give me a report, they do explain that the differences in that genetic marker may only explain 2 to 3% of the different muscle performance in different people. And while 2 or 3% doesn't really sound like much, when we get up to that world class, that Olympic level, 2 or 3% is the difference between winning gold and finishing last. And that actually makes me feel pretty good, because 2 or 3% for a recreational runner isn't really going to make that much difference. I have a feeling that if I was really focused on results, I could probably train quite a bit harder in order to make up that 2 or 3% difference. Of course, if everybody did that, if everyone just trained that little bit more, then we would all be equal, but that's the thing. Everybody doesn't train as much as you do. So if you are committed to training, you're probably going to do a lot better than the person that doesn't. I think that's probably the most obvious thing I've ever said. Okay, next genetic component of runners is injury risk, right? Some people just seem a little more prone to injury. And you know what? There have been some indications that a person's risk of injury could be related to how much collagen they have in their body. In fact, there was a study in the British Journal of Medicine that found that there was a deficit of the COL1A1 collagen gene in athletes who suffered a traumatic ACL tear. But then the article is quick to point out that this study also indicated that there was no substantial support for that finding. Probably should have left that bit out. So ultimately, most studies have not found any genetic risk for injuries. We've all got to be mindful of it and keep our injury prevention at the forefront of our mind. I think ultimately it's the same thing as training. If we just work a little harder, and in this case it's harder to prevent injury, we're probably not going to be injured. Okay, and the last part of genetics in running is height. Now, height is one of these things that has been thoroughly researched. We know all the genes that contribute to height, and studies have shown that inherited genes are 80% responsible for a person's height. And of course, the rest are going to be environmental or nutritional things. But height is one of those factors that can really affect a person's aptitude for a certain sport. And the article points out that a taller athlete might favor rowing or swimming, whereas a smaller athlete could do better at distance running or cycling. And I find this curious because obviously I am a runner. I talk to you about running on this channel. Like, I am fully invested in running. I don't row and I don't swim, but that's where the whole environmental factors come in. When I think about it and the path that I've been directed in life, running is the path of least resistance. Yes, I could join a row club. Yes, I could be a swimmer, but those require a lot more work, a lot more travel for me to get somewhere to row, for me to get to a pool to swim. So which is better, training or genetics? And we've already talked about the genetic variables that go into being a better athlete, that, or at least could contribute to you being a better athlete. But the article does say that good, consistent training will always, now remember that part, always dwarf natural ability when it comes to being a good endurance athlete. And that's because when we improve our VO2 max, when we improve our lactate threshold, that has more to do with muscle mitochondria than it does any genetic factors. And mitochondria, through angiogenesis, is produced in prolonged athletic training. My friends, that's what we do every day. Let's just briefly go back to environmental considerations. I already said that running is kind of like the path of least resistance for me, but that's not entirely true because I did start out as a runner by first being a triathlete, so I did have access to a pool, but I just kind of picked one of those 3 sports and continued with it. But the article points out a pretty good example from East Africa, and we know that we have a lot of good athletes, a lot of good runners from East Africa. And the reason that we have a lot of good runners, a lot of good athletes from East Africa, is because they have the environment for that. They have the environment to go out and run in ideal conditions. Of course, there are a lot of genetic considerations there too, but let's say we took a group of those people and we raised them in a snowy environment. Well, in all likelihood, they would probably thrive as cross-country skiers. So I guess what it comes down to, especially if you have kids, you want to lead them in a direction that the environment supports. Us as parents, we are able to create that environment in a lot of cases, but also it's been shown in studies that children that don't have the opportunity to thrive in sports, whether that's due to genetic ability, economic resources, cultural support, they're actually less likely to seek it out as adults. So even though for me as a child I was never really into sports, I don't think I had a genetic ability to do so, or at least I didn't really have the desire to participate in sports, I still participated in a lot of sports. And that I think is probably because of the cultural support. Now as a kid I didn't run much, but I did play football, played rugby, and I loved to mountain bike. So I think because I was given the opportunity to thrive in sports, even if I didn't thrive in sports, it opened the doors for me to come back to it as an adult. Have you guys experienced anything like that? I bet you have. It's probably a pretty common story. So guys, I think ultimately for most of us at least watching this video, the genetic component to being a good athlete, to being a good running, pales in comparison to what we get from training and our environment. As adults, we have a lot of control over our environment, and I mean that in the way that if we want to run, we can go and join a running club, we can surround ourselves with people that do stuff that we want to do, and we can push ourselves and we can train and we can be the best version of ourselves. And I think that's the case in pretty much anything we want to do. I often think that me as a runner, I am 100% average. There is nothing that makes me a better runner than anybody out there couldn't be. I don't run particularly fast, but I run faster than someone who sits on the couch all day. So guys, I want to hear from you, especially if your thoughts are that genetics play an outsized role in training and performance. And I haven't done too deep into this other than the article that I just pulled up to talk to you about, and I'm sure there are studies out there that demonstrate that there is an outsized effect of genetics versus training, but I don't know. I'd love to hear what your experiences and what your thoughts on the subject are. And with that, if you have made it to this point in the video, why don't you drop a double helix? Is there a double helix emoji? If there is, drop that in the comments so I know that you've made it to this point in the video. And with that, it's Matt B. This has been a chat about genetics versus training, nature versus nurture, all of that good stuff. Be kind, be happy, run well. I'll see you in a couple of days.